Welcome, and thanks for joining us for the Rock Solid Apologia podcast, where we discuss Christian apologetics, worldviews, and so much more. We're so glad that you're listening with us today. Feel free to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to keep up with all the latest news over at RSA. Now, on to today's podcast episode.
Welcome to the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast. I'm Will England, editor-in-chief of Rock Solid Apologia, and joining me today is Jon Noyes. Jon Noyes has worked with Stand to Reason since 2019. A former atheist, Jon Noyes used to think belief in God was unwarranted and irresponsible. Then, after examining the evidence for Christianity, he was faced with the fact that Jesus is who he says he is, and the Christian worldview tells the true story of reality. Ever since, Jon Noyes has been passionate about engaging the culture with honest, well-thought-out reasons with why people should trust the Christian worldview. Jon Noyes brings a unique perspective to his audiences, having more than 10 years experience in the legal field. In 2013, he earned a master's degree in Christian apologetics from Biola University, graduating with honors. Jon Noyes is a founding pastor at Solia de Gloria Church. He also serves as on the board of directors for Life Without Limbs and Bible Thinker. More than any of this, Jon is the father of 4 daughters and the husband of Rihanna. They live in Ventura County, California. Welcome to the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast, Mr. Noyes. It's so fantastic to have you.
Thank you so much, Will. It's great to be here with you. I'm excited for today's conversation.
So I wanted to talk a bit about the problem of evil, because that's one of the main objections we get hammered with as Christians. So you were a former atheist. Was the problem of evil something you'd use as an atheist when discussing with your Christian friends?
Yeah, so it was like my go-to argument, actually. As far as if I'm in a conversation with somebody about Christianity, and I loved to talk to Christians about Christianity when I was an atheist. It was one of my favorite things to do. Actually, if I found out that you were a Christian, Will, if we were like interacting or whatever, I'd say, hey, can I buy you a cup of coffee? Because I want to go out and tell you how stupid your worldview is. That's just how I was, and I was coming up as an atheist, just as, the new atheists kind of were budding, so Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, like all these guys it was kind of coming into vogue to be not just an atheist, but it was coming into vogue to be kind of an aggressive kind of jerk a little bit, and there's jerks that are Christians too. If you're an atheist and you're watching this, just because you're an atheist doesn't mean you're a jerk. You're probably a nice person, and certainly a great many Christians can be jerks too. But when I got into the conversation with you, I would have at one point or another, I would have attacked 3 main things. And they're kind of interrelated. The first one would have been the reliability of the scriptures, so biblical reliability. And then growing out of that, and really my point for that would have been to attack the resurrection, that it didn't really happen, the person of Jesus. And then my coup de grace, my cherry on top of my atheist argument Sunday would have been the problem of evil, mainly because the problem of evil is, the way I view it, it's a proactive, actual argument against the existence of God. I used to love talking about this. And this is usually where the conversation would end, to be honest, because most Christians, they couldn't really give me an answer as to why God would allow so much evil in the world.
So lay out generally for us, what is the problem of evil? I mean, that I'm learning as you go philosophical, that's super in-depth, multiple forms, but just generally, what are we going to hear when people think the problem of evil? What are we going to get?
Yeah, sure. That's a really good question. So there's going to be 2 facets here to the problem of evil. One is going to be the intellectual or logical problem of evil, and then there's the emotional problem of evil. And the intellectual problem of evil, the purpose of it is to show that there's a logical inconsistency within the Godhead, within the nature of God, mainly by pitting 2 of God's characteristics or attributes against themselves. So you've got God. The problem is stated often something like this, right? If God is all loving, he would want to rid the world of evil. if God is all powerful, he should be able to rid the world of all evil. Evil exists. Therefore, God most likely doesn't exist, or he's some, moral monster God that Richard Dawkins would describe. So that's the logical problem of evil. You see, you have God's omnibenevolence and his omnipotence, and you kind of pose them against each other. You pit them against each other. To try to show that there is an inconsistency within the nature of God. And the thing with the logical problem of evil is if it holds, it's true. It's a good argument. It disproves the existence of God. Now that's the logical problem of evil, which we can get into a little bit. In my experience now, I've been a Christian almost 20 years. In my experience now, and from my own experience, whether it be anecdotal or not, I think that most of the time when we struggle with this problem in the real world, it's not logical. It's not the logical problem of evil. It's the emotional problem of evil. For example, I had the opportunity to travel to the Nazi concentration camp of Auschwitz a couple years back. And in the process of this, I made some friends on the tour bus that were not Christians. And we were having a good conversation. It was a long bus ride, and we got off the bus. I felt like comrades, friends. And as we're standing at the gates of Auschwitz, nobody was asking the logical problem of evil of God. They were asking the heartfelt question, where was God in the face of all this evil? Right. And it's an emotional response to evil. And I think that that's probably the more common underlying objection to the problem of evil is emotional as opposed to logical. And one of the reasons why I say that is because I think we have really good answers to both of these versions of the problem of evil. But I think that we can show pretty quickly that just because God is all loving and all powerful doesn't mean he doesn't have room for allowing evil in the world. So I don't think the logical problem of evil holds very long. I think it breaks down pretty quickly.
I've heard on the intellectual side, you have the logical one, and then you have the inductive one. And at least at the level of higher philosophers, the logical one, again, not on the internet, but at the level of higher philosophers, the logical one has been kind of abandoned, and we just go the inductive. Well, on balance, it seems like a good God probably doesn't exist, but we can't say it's a logical impossibility.
Yeah, and that's where I mean, who am I to buck against philosophical trends or deep philosophical issues? But when I survey the world as it really is, right? So here's the deal: is like we all have to answer this is the powerful thing about the problem of evil. We all have to answer for evil, whether you're an atheist or a Christian. Because even in the logical problem of evil, right? You have three premises really, then followed by the conclusion. Well, the third premise is evil exists. And that's something that we all know from personal experience, from living in the world. Evil exists, and then I think that we have good reason. I think God, I can think of a great many reasons why God would allow evil and suffering. Now, to what extent, or is it then we can talk about gratuitous suffering and things like this. But even so, I'm not sure that there's such a thing as gratuitous suffering. On the plan of God, especially God who's not just omnipotent, not just omnibenevolent, but he's also all-knowing. He's also sovereign. So he knows the beginning and from the end. Then I don't know that. So that there's room, I think, to answer these tough questions in a robust fashion, actually.
So let's focus in on that third premise, that evil exists. And let's talk about evil existing from a naturalist perspective, and then evil existing from a Christian perspective. I believe the argument goes like evil exists, and therefore God, this is a problem for God. Can evil exist on a naturalistic, materialistic worldview?
Yeah, this is a good question. Experientially, clearly, evil exists. This is a fundamental feature of reality. Every single person, when they live in the world, knows when they've experienced some semblance of evil, whether it be there's something stolen from them, or a breakup with a girlfriend, or the death of a parent, or whatever it might be. Evil exists, but every worldview has to give an answer as to uh, why and what is evil. And on atheism, I think this puts the atheist in a really difficult spot, because it's, speaking as a former atheist, I knew certain things were wrong. I knew certain things were evil, but what did I mean when I said certain things were evil? Like, was I describing my emotions? Or was I saying this action or this thing is actually wrong? Well, it's the latter. I wasn't merely describing my emotions. But on atheism, I don't think you have a basis for what we call objective morality, right? Or objective right and wrong, meaning a system of judging right from wrong that's outside of our personal experience. It's objective versus subjective. On atheism, I think all we're left with is, excuse me, all we're left with is relativism, ultimately, where I'm the arbiter of what's right and wrong, ultimately. Or as an atheist, that, to be fair, I would have said it's a cultural consensus. It's it's a social contract. Is what I would have said, in as far as a society, how you come to what's right and wrong. But that's just relativism dressed up. And if relativism is the law of the land, if that rules the day, then you can't really say anything at its base is right or wrong. You have no problem of evil, because you have nothing to object to as being evil. You just have the way that it is. Does that make sense? Does that even answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. You can't have objective evil because you can't have objective law, and therefore you can't have objective lawgiver. I think the example given, it might have been Greg Kokel that said this, but it's like, how can you speed on a road in which there is no speeding limit?
That's right. Yeah, he mentions the Autobahn, right? Yeah. So the point is in order for there to in order for anybody to bring up the problem of evil, they have to appeal to an objective standard that's outside of themselves. And if you have no God, not only do you have no standard, but you have no standard giver. So as an atheist, you're short, which is actually interesting, because the problem of evil, in a very real sense, it actually disproves both relativism and atheism. So in a sense, the problem of evil, as the atheist brings up the problem of evil, they're actually proving their own worldview of naturalism false, right? Because when somebody objects to the problem of evil, they say that evil exists. That means they're saying that evil is out there in some sense, and so the evil that they're objecting to needs to be a detail of the external world, more than just like my personal preference or personal opinion. And then this is the key point, I think, that your viewers, if you're watching this, and that we can take away from this, Will, is that if naturalism is true, then there's no problem of evil. Right? If morality is just a matter of personal preference or cultural consensus, then there's really no problem to object to based on the existence of evil in the world. And on this view, on naturalism, a transcendent, objective, moral obligation, all of these things, they're fictions. They're not facts. They're not part of the real world. And so that means behaviors, whatever it might be, stealing or murder or rape, they can be distasteful, meaning that individuals, certain individuals in the culture dislike them. They can be taboo. They can go against cultural consensus, but they can't be wrong in the ultimate, like in any ultimate sense. And the reason why ultimately is because on naturalism, all we are is a random quantification of molecules, right? We're just bags of chemicals. We're just matter in motion. We're just particles. But when we sin, when we commit acts of wrong, we don't commit acts of wrong against particles. We commit them against people. And again, this was very, very clear to me when I traveled to Auschwitz and even talked to some non-believers there. That this became very, very clear. And so you have to be able to define what evil is, right?
So
I don't understand.
I think honestly, the best way for an atheist to go about this would be to assume the Christian worldview is true and then question why evil is allowed from within our worldview, and leaving behind naturalism. So going
And I think that's largely when I'm talking to somebody who kind of knows their stuff, that's what they're doing. They're assuming that the Christian worldview is true for the sake of the argument, right?
Yep.
So they're positive because it's an objection against our God. So for at least a moment, they have to assume our worldview, and that's why that's where the logical problem of evil comes in, right? They're assuming that our God looks like something. There are certain qualities that are true about our God, should he exist, and those qualities are inconsistent with the existence of evil. But also, like this is a double-edged sword. When you assume that my worldview is true, when you raise an objection against my worldview or our worldview, will that means we have complete access to my worldview to answer the objection. And this is where I think Christians often get this wrong when they try to engage in this conversation with an atheist. There's two things that I think that they get wrong. And the first, maybe we'll get to later, is that the atheist, by bringing up the problem of evil, has done nothing to solve the problem of evil. They still have the problem in their worldview. Evil still exists on naturalism because we experience it. All they've done by objecting to the existence of God based on evil is get rid of one of the possible solutions. So they're actually kind of handicapping themselves. The second thing that atheists do that I wanted to talk about, what was it? Or puts them in an interesting place. I forget. Shoot. Oh,
they lose it's always interesting to be like, you get rid of God. It's like, okay, great. You've gotten rid of hope. Now perhaps you could be intellectually satisfied, but you're completely hope deprived.
Yeah. And hope, I think, is a real thing. I mean, I speak mostly right now. I've been consumed pretty much with the issue of suicide. For the last 5 years, I've been speaking on suicide. It's my most requested talk. It's and it's not because of really anything having to do with me. I'm not an expert in really anything. It's just because of where the culture's at. And the main issue, the central issue, and then that in suicide, having to do with suicide, is a loss of hope. And hope is a real thing. It's a real thing that exists that we all need. And you're right. The atheist who I think naturalism in general at its core is a materialistic, narcissistic view of reality. I mean, it leaves its proponents completely empty, devoid, if lived logically out. Now, I'm not saying that in an atheist world, or an atheist, if you're watching this, that you don't think certain things are wrong and that you don't derive purpose or meaning or value for life, or that you're hopeless. What I'm saying is that on naturalism, you have to borrow from another worldview in order to get things like hope, meaning, purpose, and even an understanding of right from wrong. You don't have that on your system, so you got to steal from another worldview, as Frank Turek says, right? You steal from Christianity. And you can't even define what evil is. Never mind object to the existence of God on it. You may know this, Will, but there's a famous debate between Frederick Copleston and Bertrand Russell years and years and years ago. And it was when Bertrand Russell, a devout naturalist, a very sophisticated thinker, he brought up this problem, and he said to, I'm paraphrasing, but he said to Copleston, what do you say when you kneel at the bed of a dying child, right? And it was this big crescendo moment in the conversation because, like, well, what are you going to say? You're going to try to argue for God. But then Copleston responded to him, I have plenty to say. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but I have plenty to say. What are you going to say? Tough luck? This is the way it is when you kneel at the bed of a dying child, and I think this is a poignant point, because the Christian worldview is a worldview that its central message is hope. And actually, if you think about it, well, the Christian story, the whole thing from the third chapter all the way through is about the problem of evil, right? The problem starts in chapter 3 of our first book, Genesis, and it's resolved 66 books later in Revelation, where every tear is dried, right? And all evil and suffering are done away with in an ultimate fashion. So actually, the Christian worldview has a lot to say.
I can't find it, but Dawkins has this quote I'm paraphrasing because I can't find it. I was looking just now about there's nothing more glorious than looking up into the sky and realizing that this is all there is. And I think Dawkins means that to be sort of a rallying cry, um, to cheer up atheists. But I always wonder, like, if Richard Dawkins, could he say that when he's at a graveside? Like, look up into the sky and say that.
And I'm sure I'm almost 100% positive that wouldn't be and isn't his response standing at the gates of Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like you know, it's just not how we are, because that's this and this is where I think that it's important. Sometimes these conversations about the problem of evil, and they're sophisticated arguments, and there's some philosophers who do amazing jobs in dissecting this problem. But it all comes back to the fact that the world is a certain way, and we all have to live in that world. So the question that we're asking, the question we should always be asking, whether it be at the problem of evil or the Kalam cosmological argument of the existence of God or whatever, I mean, nutrition or working out or reading, whatever, is, does my worldview adequately explain the way the world really is? You know, and so what we do is we take the information that the world from the world out in there living life, and we have to experience the world, and we traverse the world, we live in it, and then we need to figure out, okay, what explanation is there to explain the phenomena that I experience? And in this case, the existence of right and wrong, evil and good. What worldview better explains these things? Is it naturalism or is it Christianity? You know, and it seems to me, and I mean, we could do this we could include every worldview out there, right? Because we could, but in our conversation right now, we're talking about the naturalist and the Christian. So as we seek to offer answers to this fundamental component of the world, something that we all experience, which is the existence of evil, which worldview offers the best explanation? Which world accurately describes the way the world really is? That's reality. And the thing about reality is reality is that thing that you bump into when you don't live according to it. So, and sometimes those bumps hurt. And that's why I think oftentimes the atheists, they don't want to bend their knee, especially on the problem of evil. Because once you start admitting, once you start going down the path of the problem of evil and start understanding, I think from a real intellectual depth, I think you start to see that naturalism doesn't offer adequate explanations to the existence of evil. So it's actually it's a problem for the naturalist, not for the Christian. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit, and this goes into a little bit of the realm of conjecture because it's theology, but I find it really interesting. Evil in the Christian worldview, in your opinion, did God create evil? Would you go the evil is a little bit like darkness, which is simply the absence of light? How would you go about reconciling or discussing that?
Yeah, so the way that I describe it when I speak on this topic is I define evil as two things. Yeah, and this is from Greg Koukl. Evil is something, and evil is not something. And what I mean by that is evil is something in that it exists. We experience it. It's real. It's a fundamental feature of reality. But it's not something in that it doesn't exist like evil's not like some, you can't go into your grocery store and buy a half pound of evil. Like, it doesn't exist like that. So it's something, meaning that we experience it, but it's not something, meaning it didn't come into existence. It's actually like what you said, it's the deprivation of something. It's the deprivation of good. And the illustration I like to use is a donut hole. Right? The donut hole is where the donut ain't. So you don't eat a donut hole. I mean, now there's these things called donut holes, but they're not really donut holes. Like a donut is made like in a donut shape with a hole in the middle. There's no such thing as the donut in the donut hole. And that's like evil. So evil is a deprivation, or I think you used a good illustration would be a shadow. So evil is like a shadow in goodness. It's the deprivation of something, meaning, and then this is why this is important. right? And meaning that if evil wasn't created, that means God's not responsible for it. And that's, I think, a key point here. So it's not something. And because it's not something, it was never created. It's the absence of something. That means God's not responsible for it. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then this really goes into the realm of conjecture, and hopefully we won't spend too much time on this, but John Calvin talks a little bit about the difference between God's, there's no distinction between what God wills and what God allows. So if it happens, basically, God must have willed it in some sense or the other. Would you say the fall was in God's plan in one sense or the other, or maybe
Yeah,
that
well,
wasn't the
absolutely.
original plan?
Yeah. So I'm a fan of John Calvin. So yeah, I mean, I mean, he doesn't get everything right, I don't think, but with this, I think he does. Yes, God is sovereign, and this is all God's plan A. There is no plan B on the economy of God, which is to me is it's incredibly comforting. Because I know that God is in control and nothing is out of his control. So the fall was most certainly part of God's plan. He knew exactly what was going to happen and when, and he has good reason for it. He didn't create evil, so it doesn't need a creator. Um, which kind of also begs the question of where did evil come from then, right? And in the garden, right, when this is when we turn when we since the challenge is brought up against the Christian worldview, the God of the Bible, that means we can go to the Bible to seek answers to the challenge. And again, it goes back to the fact, if we want to ask the question on our worldview, where did evil come from then? Well, God didn't create it, therefore he's not responsible for it. But we go to chapter 3 of our first book, and there we have it, right? God created everything very, very good. And then the fall is what we call it. Satan said, "Did God really say?" And Eve took the fruit and she ate and she handed it to Adam and he ate, and enter evil. And then the rest of the story is dealing with that decision, that moment, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I wanted to do like a brief overview of different theodicies. I think I'll end with the one that, if I remember correctly, you like the best, so we could sort of spend the most time on that one. But I just wanted
Okay.
to go through a few of the common ones, maybe give an overview of what they are. And then, if you like it, you could give the pros. If you don't like it, feel free to give the cons. But just sort of go back and forth a little bit on some of the different theodicies that people use. And theodicy is just how do you answer the problem of evil? The big term for that. Um, so let's start with the free will defense, because that's the common one. God allows evil because you need to have freedom to have love. Um, I
Yeah.
guess give an overview. I mean, I way oversimplified it to that, so maybe add a little bit to it if you want, and then your opinion on it.
Yeah, well, the basic idea is that in order for God to have a created being who fully loves him, making love possible, even that person has to have at least some semblance of free will.
Yeah,
Because if you force somebody to love you, or you create them in a deterministic fashion, or you make them kind of like an automatron, and love is your posture, then that's not really love. Because in order to have love, there has to be a choice, right? You have to have the opportunity, the option at least, not to love. I don't like. Listen, like, and I'm just speaking honestly, Will. Like, that's all I have for you today is probably nothing super profound. Just where I'm at, honestly, is I do not know where God's sovereignty starts and our free will begins, man. Um, I wrestle with this a lot. Actually, this is probably one of the questions I wrestle with most internally, at least. And now at the position that I'm in, the place where I am in my walk, in my journey, is I tend to think that God's sovereignty is probably there's more of that than there is of my free will. Now, am I, and the response to these things is, well, if you don't have free will, then you're a determined being, and that means you can't love. I don't know about that. I think that when we start talking about God, right? Once God softens our hearts and he gains and infuses, I should say, maybe our affections towards him into us through the Holy Spirit, I don't understand why that can't be a true act of love. I also think when we offer this specifically to the problem of evil, when we offer a free will defense, I think there's different issues. I think that we can offer, okay, let me back up a second because I should say this. I think the free will defense works. I think it adequately answers the challenge of the problem of evil. So you can use it, and it's one way to show that the problem of evil, the answer to the problem of evil would be the reason why there's so much evil is because of free will, and I think that that's part of that is certainly true, right? The world that we live in is fallen, corrupted because this world being fallen and corrupted produces fallen and corrupted men. And fallen and corrupted men produce fallen and corrupted situations, i.e., our sin has devastating effects, right? And we're naive to think if our sin is limited just to ourselves, like the consequences of our sin. The consequences of our sin affect the world around us. When I sin, my family, for example, is affected. The environment is affected. I mean, everything was affected by the fall. So. Sin has devastating consequences, and some of those sins are due to our free will, for sure. So I think it answers the objection. The problem with it is I think it brings up possibly different issues with who God is, right? I think it makes God maybe it's like God's a lifeguard, right? And and he sees somebody drowning, and his response to that is like, oh, well, that's their free choice. Oh, well, so there's a different issue with the character of God that's raised, in my opinion. I got that. I didn't get that's not mine. I got it from reading this guy, Gordon Clark, on this issue. It raises other issues. And that's so when I'm offering an answer to the problem of evil, especially to a Christian audience, like you and I were just at Summit Ministries together earlier this summer. So when I'm speaking to the Summit students who are largely, I'm assuming, are Christian students, I'm not going to offer the free will defense outright, mainly because I think it brings up other issues that we have to talk about. But, however, I can see in the context of a conversation with an atheist, a naturalist that brings up the problem of evil, I could see myself possibly appealing to the free will defense in order to answer the objection, even though I have questions about the free will defense. I'm willing to, for the sake of the argument, stipulate that certain things have to be true, like we have more than a compatibilistic semblance of free will, or we have a libertarian free will, which I'm not necessarily sure that. Well, I mean, we do have libertarian free will in that the words that are coming out of my mouth, I think I'm freely choosing. But when it comes to large issues like how we're saved and things like this, I think it's a sense of issues.
That's basically where I've end up coming down to is like philosophically, it's great. Biblically, am I convinced of it? No.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah, well, I think that, and that's where for me, and maybe this is because my background is pastoral ministry and naturalism. So I was a naturalist, I was an atheist, and then I became a Christian, and then I became a pastor, and now I'm an apologist. So I wonder if my background influences that. So my background isn't straight philosophy. So I have some really great brothers and sisters who are philosophers, and their go-to answer is a lot of the time their go-to answer is the free will defense. And I understand that, but maybe it's because, one, I don't have as in-depth understanding of the philosophy, but also I always lean theology first. So I think theology is truly the queen of the sciences. And I think that if I can't justify my position biblically, meaning from the Bible theologically, then I think there's more for us to look for. There's something else. And free will, the more I read the scriptures, the less of it I think we have. I hope that's fair. I'm going to get like all these people asking me questions now, but That's where I'm at.
I don't know if it's fair or not, but I certainly agree with you on that. So I don't know the technical name for this theodicy. I'm sure there's a name for it, and I'm sure he didn't come up with it. But James White, don't agree with everything he says, but he'll do his theodicy generally goes something along the lines of God allows evil because it glorifies himself through the just punishment of some and then the salvation of Christians. So it allows God to get the most glory by showing all his attributes. I'm oversimplifying what he says, but I mean, that's another theodicy I've heard thrown out there.
Yeah, I'm probably actually more inclined to agree with White on this than I am like the free will defense.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're all good answers and this is why I think as Christian apologists, we should be open to using the tools that we have with the understanding that we're limited finite beings. That means our intellect is limited and finite. That means I am under the impression that a large swath of the knowledge that I have about who God is probably inaccurate. So I think that any of these defenses, what we're doing is we're struggling with a real life issue, and trying to come up with the best explanation to answer all the objections. And that means I think it's okay for us to use multiple different types of answers. That's why I would never say I'm an evidentialist or a presuppositionalist or a classicalist or whatever when it comes to apologetics, because I'm going to use the tools that God's given to me, whether they be arguments based on evidence or I like the transcendental argument for the existence of God too. I like some presuppositional stuff. I also love William Lane Craig and everything he does, and I'm going to use it. And the same thing is true here of the problem of evil, where I like that. Like, so when we talk about like, well, why did God allow evil in the first place? Well, for his glory is, I think, a true and a right answer. Again, we have access to our worldview in answering this question. So if you're going to assume, if you're an atheist and you're going to for a moment assume that the problem of evil is real and God exists, and then you're going to object to the existence of God on those assumptions that you're making for the sake of the argument, that means the answer, again, can assume those same things. The answer can assume that God exists, and specifically the God of the Bible. And when I look at the biblical narrative and the biblical story, you started out, well, was this part of God's plan? Absolutely. Why was the fall part of God's plan? Well, for his ultimate glory. This is the way God, being the author and the creator of everything, being the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, this is the way that God has chosen to reveal himself and his glory through the salvific plan that he has for man. And that includes suffering. But also let's remember that we have a God who in this plan, because of the chapter 3 in Genesis, because of the fall, we have a God who entered into the suffering with us. So he's not some far off being that just created it, messed it up, and then pieced out. He's the creator God who allows struggle, but he enters into our struggle. He has suffered more evil. God has suffered more evil than any of us ever will. If you, in a very real sense, the crucifixion of Jesus is the most evil event that's happened in human history, right? And it happens not apart from God, but in the face of God, with God's knowledge and being the central part of his plan. So I think I like White on this. I think I haven't read him, I don't think, like explicitly, but I just listened to his podcast and some of his books, and have a great deal of respect for him. As I do William Lane Craig and these other people too.
There's just this one debate. There's a clip where you can find it on YouTube. It's James White versus David Silverman, and then Frank Turek versus David Silverman. And it's just an interesting contrast between, I call it
Silverman. Is Silverman an atheist?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I have no idea who he is beyond, I've listened to those debates, but it's the same question. That it's because it's the same atheist. He literally frames it the exact same way. So you can listen to two different theodicies and two polar different people answering it and just compare and contrast them. And it's interesting to me.
Yeah, that is interesting. And because those are two different, because Turk, I don't know if he owns the Molinist label, but I think that's what so he's going to be a free will guy.
Oh yeah.
And White is a presuppositionalist unapologetically, and so he's going to be glory of God. And I sympathize with both, um, with both answers, and I'll use both. I lean towards White and glory of God stuff, mainly because I think it helps answer other issues as well. You know, as to answering the specific question, then, well, does evil serve a purpose in this world? If it's just a matter of free will choice, I think that leaves room for gratuitous evil and things like this. But if God actually has a purpose in this evil, and ultimately it is the point, I think, point everybody back to his glory. C.S. Lewis said, and I'm gonna butcher this probably. He said something to the effect, pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks to our conscience, but God shouts to us in our pains. Pain is God's megaphone to arouse a deaf world. So I think that God has a good reason to allow pain and suffering more than free will. In fact, I'm trying to think now. When Jesus, I'm not gonna know the address to this. Dang it. Jesus, right? So the Tower of Siloam fell and killed a bunch of people,
Yeah.
right? And I forget where it happened. I should know this, but the Tower of Siloam fell and killed a bunch of people. And his disciples came to him and asked him the question, like, oh my gosh, what about all that evil? Basically, is what they're asking. And I mean, it's dealing with a slightly different issue. It's like more of like almost a karma issue. But Jesus's answer, when in responding basically to the problem of evil to his guys, what seems like gratuitous evil, he didn't offer a free will defense or anything like that. He used the opportunity to call people to repentance. He says, "And do you think again, summarizing, do you think you're any different than those who perished or those who died? If you do not repent, you shall likewise perish," is what Jesus said to the problem of evil. So he used this issue to point people to the need for a rescue, as opposed to offering like, oh well, it's their free will, or people make bad decisions. The tower was built not according to standard, whatever. So yeah, but yeah. Anyway, so I lean towards White on these issues.
It's Luke 13.
Okay. Yeah.
Look that up. So for people who want to go look and see it, Luke chapter 13. Then also wanted to touch on the soul building theodicy, which is honestly the one I've studied the least. So what is the soul building theodicy? And then you could go with the pros or the cons, either way you want to go.
Yeah. So soul building theodicy is the idea that God allows us to suffer in order to build us up, like build the soul up, right? Ultimately, it finds this is where I usually go most of the time, because I think there's good biblical support for it, right? These are but momentary light afflictions, producing in us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. This is soul building. Paul is saying two things. One, the suffering and then the tribulations and trials that we're going through, they're momentary. It will pass, especially on a divine heavenly timeline, right? The things God is placing us in these circumstances for a reason, and they will stop. But notice there is a reason. That's the second thing Paul's pointing us to. These things are momentary, but the suffering that we go through now is creating something in us that otherwise wouldn't be there. Mainly what Paul is saying, that the suffering that we go through this side of glory is preparing us for glory. It's preparing us. Suffering is preparing us to rule and reign in heaven or on the new earth alongside King Jesus forever and ever and ever and ever. And God is and God, we need to suffer in order to kind of be prepared for that. And I can think of a number of reasons why. Mainly among them would be that when we get to glory, we're going to recognize how glorious glory really is. You know, if life here was swimming and perfect, if you and I had our best life now, when we got to glory, it'd be like, this is kind of cool. and but it's like when you go to like when you experience this world, not just like seeing the evil out there, but experiencing us participating in doing wrong and doing evil, and the consequences not just on us, but like I said before, the people around us. When we get to glory, I think that there's going to be a level of appreciation that we can't even really comprehend. Hence, we're not going to want to sin because none of us are going to want to go back to there. So even if free will is a component, right? Even if in glory we have free will, we won't use that free will to fall again because we've experienced this world fallen and broken, and so God needs to. But I mean, even more than that, I mean, God uses the evil and the suffering in our life to give us hope. We talked about hope, right? So again, Paul says that tribulation produces perseverance, proven character, hope, and a hope that does not disappoint. And right before Paul says that, like, I start getting really excited with this stuff because this is where I think hope is found, and this is where I think the best answer for the problem of evil is found, honestly, because I just get up about it. I really like this stuff. Right before he says tribulation produces perseverance, proven character, hope, and hope that does not disappoint. Paul says that I glory in my suffering, right? So Paul takes pleasure, and it's not that we seek suffering out. It's not that he doesn't like, oh yeah, I'm suffering again. This is euphoric. This is amazing. No, but he knows that the result of the suffering is ultimately glory. And so he can, and you and I, when we go through times of trial and whatever it might be, big and small, we can have confidence. We can trust that God is working in us that which he sees is well pleasing, and he's building us into the person that he wants us to be. And this also, I think, is a good way to answer gratuity. I don't think there is gratuitous suffering on this. I think God has reasons to allow all the suffering, even the worst. And I don't know them. I don't pretend to know them, but I think that God does. And I think that we have good biblical support, not just from Paul, but I mean, go back to late chapters of Genesis, right? The story of the account of Joshua, right? No, Joseph, right? His technicolor, his coat, yeah. Right? Joseph's coat. And after living a life of incredible loss and trials and suffering and evil, I mean, abandoned by his brothers, sold into slavery, only to rise up to the ranks, be falsely accused of adultery with Potiphar's wife, and Potiphar thrown him back to the dungeons, and all of this over and over again. At the end of it all, when he's there with his brothers in Egypt, right? What does he say? He says, what man has meant for evil, God has meant for good. And then he goes on to say, and I don't have the scripture right in front of me. I could probably find it pretty quick. Let me just, because I think it's important. Shoot. Anyways, what God is, I don't have it here, but basically what he's saying is that what man has meant for evil, God has meant for good, and he gives why. Why? Because he saved an entire people group, i.e., Egypt. I mean, Israel, as they were coming into Egypt, God's chosen race, God's chosen people were being saved from famine because of Joseph's story, which included a tremendous amount of suffering. So I think God has good reason to allow these things for building up of the soul and preparing us ultimately for glory. So that's usually where I go when I'm answering this, because I also think it speaks to the heart, not just the head. Again, it goes back to what we said at the very beginning, right? There's the logical problem of evil, right? There's these intellectual conversations that we can have with each other, but there's also the emotional problem, and I think the emotional problem is actually greater than the logical problem. It's fairly easy, I think, to solve the logical problem of evil, and but we need to speak not just the heart, but we need the minds, but we got to speak to the heart. And I think when we start talking soul building theodicy, it speaks to the heart, and because we all have to live in this world. We all have to live in the world that God made, and part of that is suffering, and each and every one of us goes through that. And I feel like the soul building theodicy calls people to God, and gives good reason why he'd allow the evil, but also it explains why they go through suffering, and then that God is building them up. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, one follow up on that. Um, this is simultaneously one of the dumbest objections I've ever heard and one of the smartest I've heard. But an atheist was talking about evil, and he said it's easy to understand. This was Alex O'Connor, an opening statement. I think it was with Jonathan McClatchy, but he said it's easy to understand how something good could come out of someone having cancer or some massive thing in your life. It's easy to see how something good could come out of that. But he questioned why God would allow you to stub your toe. You'll forget about it in a couple weeks.
Yeah.
And it's like, why? What's the point of that
Sure.
mundane evil? Like, it's not.
Even that, Will, I think there's a decent answer to.
Mhm.
Like for example, there are people with this disease. It's called CIPA disease, CIPA disease, and they're born with the inability to feel pain. And at first look or first thought, I remember when I looked into this a little bit, I was like, wow, that would be awesome. Like you could like run through walls, like you'd be like a real life superhero, except superheroes' bones don't get broken, infections don't sit in, and they don't have to get legs amputated. Like these people, you could lean against a burning stove and not feel it, but your flesh will burn off. So you don't realize it until you smell literally your flesh cooking. Or there's cases where a kid will fall off a deck and think nothing of it, but they've broken their arm and they don't know it until it's too late. And infection sets in. They have to amputate the kid's arm. Like I've read these accounts, and you, every single day every single day that person is praying that they would feel pain every single day, because even there's something as mundane as a stubbed toe, pain also does serve another purpose. Pain serves as a warning to us when something's not right. So we are intricately designed beings, according to biblical theology, biblical anthropology, right? So we're intricately designed, and part of that design is that we have pain receptors, and part of that is so that it serves as a warning to us when something ain't right, including stubbing the toe. I mean, I stubbed my toe on one of my daughter's beds has a central post like right on the edge, and I'm like, what in the world? Why is this here? And then every single time I go to tuck her in, and not every time, but like I'm probably 4 times out of 10, I'm stubbing my stinking toe on that. And you'd think I'd learn, but it's also a reminder that the world is a certain way. It's a warning that something is wrong, and then you can magnify these things like stubbing toe. There's no moral component to, right? There's nobody can really object to the existence of God based on stubbed toes. Like let's just be honest with you, right? But again, even in naturalists who brings that up, they're appealing to an oughtness. They're saying in their minds, "Ouch, this shouldn't be here. Like, why is this hurt?" Well, if you're just a random quantification of molecules, that question doesn't make sense. It's just the way that it is, and then that's it. Like, there's no deeper thinking about it. So anyways, yeah, that's interesting though. I haven't, maybe I have heard that once or twice before, but I can't. Anyways, yeah, stubbing your toe.
A friend of mine just sent it to me. I was like, it's so fascinating because on one hand, it's so dumb, but on the other hand, if you think about it, it's like, okay, at least it's a rabbit trail to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great, like, as you even said, I'm thinking, okay, well, God causes all things to work together for the good of those who love God and to those who are called according to his promises, right? So even stubbed toes, right? But what's the goodness? I don't know. And that's the other thing too. Like there's a great number. Why Auschwitz?
Mm-hmm.
These things that are just like, I mean, like evil. Like why Auschwitz? Or the killing fields of Cambodia, or or the Rwandan genocide, or the AIDS epidemic in Africa, or like what is like what's that? Like how and I don't. And the thing is that we have to understand on the Christian response is that we aren't God. So I'm not claiming to be omniscient. But again, we have access to our worldview, and I can wrestle with these things in the context of knowing who God is. And this is actually, Will, why theology is so important. This is why I think theology should undergird our philosophy and not the other way around, is because we need to know who God is in order to truly understand the world that he's made, including our understanding of it and how we think in philosophy. And so when we come to an accurate and right understanding of who God is, we can trust him, right? The more you get to know about God, right? God is love, and he's beautiful, he's magnificent, he's awesome in the truest sense of the word. He's all knowing, he's all caring, he's compassionate, but he's also just and holy and wrathful, and his attributes, they all combined to make God who God is, and he's unchanging and all of this stuff, right? Immutable. And when we understand this and we place things into that system, our tendency is to highlight or spotlight certain attributes of God. And when we do that, sometimes we do it at the cost or the expense of one of his other attributes. So oftentimes we'll say, well, if God's all loving, well, God is all loving and he is love, but he's also all just and he's holy. So, but for me, it works in the reverse, where some people that causes a problem, and they like, for me, it offers a lot of comfort, because even in the face of something that I think seems unfair, I also have an understanding that God, even though he's wrathful and holy and just, and sometimes the things that flow out of that I don't like, I also trust him completely, because I know he's loving and compassionate and kind, and he's ultimately given us his son. You know, God gave us Jesus so that anyone who would believe in him will not perish but inherit eternal life. So our God's a saving God. And so I put these things on in the face of these hard things, and I can trust God in that, even though I can't maybe articulate or come up with an adequate explanation this side of glory as to why he'd allowed something like Auschwitz. But I know that he has purpose in it. And there's a great many things, I alluded to it just a minute ago, there's a great many things about God that I don't like, but that's tough. I'm not God. Like if I could snap my fingers and get rid of hell, for example, I would do it in a heartbeat. You know, I'm the only believer in my family. You know, all of my family from back east, all of them are atheists. I would love it if tomorrow morning I woke up and hell wasn't a reality, and universalism was true. But again, it comes back to, how is the world? The world is a certain way, and universalism isn't an accurate descriptor of the way the world really is. So just because I don't like something doesn't mean it's not true. This is something I teach my kids all the time. Your parents have probably taught you this. You don't have to like it, buddy, but it doesn't change the fact that it's not true.
And I feel like for people, especially my age, trying to make their faith their own, I get myself in trouble, especially with youth pastors, for saying this, but I think it's true. If you read the Bible and you like everything in it, I question how much you actually understand your faith.
Yeah.
Like you started to make your faith your own when you found stuff you don't like or that makes you really uncomfortable. It's like, yes. I question, have you read it, or do you understand it if there isn't something there that you're like, whoa, I don't know what to do with that? But especially for people my age, it's like, okay, that actually shows that you've made your faith your own a little bit, because you've actually thought it through. You've actually read it. You understand it. Yeah.
And it's okay to struggle. Like, oftentimes I feel like we tell people, or people are told that, it's not good. Just don't ask that question, or don't struggle with that. And that's the worst answer. Like, it's okay to struggle through these things. It's okay to doubt, as long as you do it well, and mainly you're asking questions, and you're doing it in community, and you're seeking robust, good answers, not just going to one side or the other. You're actually wrestling through the issue. That's how things happen, right? Again, it goes back to the purpose for struggling in evil. It's the same thing with intellectual thought and stuff. We need to, the way that you build muscle is you cause trauma to it. The way that you build trust and confidence in God is that you cause trauma. You dig into the hard things. You don't ignore them. And then you do so on the basis that we don't believe. I do not believe that Christianity. I don't believe in Christianity because it makes me feel good. I believe in Christianity because it's true. It's the true story of reality. Christianity better explains the way the world really is, including the problem of evil, I think.
Well, it's been so great to have you on the podcast.
My pleasure.
If people want to go and find more of your apologetic stuff, where can they go to look?
Great question. So go to str.org. That's just Stand to Reason. That's who I work for. And that's the only place I really post.
Okay.
I'm like anti-social media at the moment. So I don't post anything on Facebook or Twitter. I've never been on TikTok or Instagram. So yeah, go to str.org and there you'll get my blogs and everything like that. Yeah, and videos.
Well, thanks again for joining us. That wraps up the latest edition of the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast, minus a bit of the satire this time. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Also, go ahead and share with us in the comments how you found out about us. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast.